All right, so let's talk about Bill Maher. He had a bit recently where he talked about Bitcoin mining, and he suggested that Bitcoin mining could single handedly push the world's temperature 2 degrees, thus obliterating the Paris Agreement and our climate targets. He doesn't refer to the study in question by name, but he's clearly referring to the Mora et al. Paper from the University of Hawaii entitled Bitcoin Emissions Alone Could Push Global Warming Above 2 Degrees. This is from 2018. He's also wrong. He says it's published in the journal Nature. It's not. It's published in the journal Nature Climate Change. Now, it may have a relationship with Nature, but it's a different journal. So the first thing to understand about this paper is that there have been multiple academic responses to the paper already because it's incredibly flawed. So I'll just run through them quickly. The first one is called Rational Mining Limits Bitcoin Emissions. Basically, they make the point that Mora et al. Are using implausible estimates of the kinds of hardware active on the Bitcoin network. If you assume that very old ASICs are mining Bitcoin, you're going to get bad answers for the energy consumption of Bitcoin because those older machines use more energy per unit of hash rate. So Mora et al. Apparently makes a mistake there in terms of making these bad assumptions about the machines active on the network. The second response is called Implausible Projections Overestimate Near-Term Bitcoin CO2 Emissions. They have a bunch of reactions. They say the use of transactions as the driver of future Bitcoin emissions is questionable, given the tenuous correlation between transactions and mining energy use. They basically say that Mora et al.'s methodology doesn't make sense. That Bitcoin's energy use doesn't really correlate with transactional intensity, which we'll get into in a second. They also say all the Bitcoin adoption scenarios represent sudden and improbable departures from historical trends in Bitcoin transactions. We'll get into this as well. But the third response, which is the best one, I think, says we believe that the analysis of Mora et al. Is flawed because their methodology ignores fundamental constraints imposed by the transaction processing capacity of the Bitcoin network. The diffusion scenarios presented by Mora et al. For Bitcoin transactions eventually assume 314 billion Bitcoin-related cashless transactions per year, or 10,000 transactions per second. So let's dig into the study's methodology quickly. They basically model out the adoption of various technologies. They presume that Bitcoin could have growth like those other technologies effectively, and they presume that Bitcoin will increase the number of transactions eventually to over hundreds of billions of transactions a year. For context, it does around 300,000 transactions a day, much less, 7 to 10 transactions a second. Mora et al. Then infer a per transaction energy cost and an implied carbon outlay based on the 2018 energy cost of energy outlay of the network and the transactional capacity. And they basically assume that there's a fundamental relationship there, and they sort of linearly extrapolate that to a world where there are hundreds of billions of Bitcoin transactions a year. So where do they go wrong? First of all, Bitcoin's not really going to grow far beyond its current limits in terms of transactions. We had a whole civil war about this. Bitcoin block size, the transaction processing ability, the sort of data throughput of the network is capped at around 3 megabytes per block. That's not really going to increase dramatically. Second of all, there's no key relationship between a transaction on the Bitcoin network and the energy usage. 90% of the energy that is being consumed by Bitcoin miners has to do with the issuance of new Bitcoins, the creation of new Bitcoins. Only 10% of the network's miner revenue and hence energy outlay is a function of transaction fees. And so for sure, ultimately at equilibrium, those fees alone will subsidize miners. But again, we're not going to get hundreds of billions of transactions per year. Bitcoin has only processed something like 600 million transactions all time in its 12 years of history. The other thing this study does wrong is it assumes that the energy mix of miners, which they don't know for sure. In 2018, nobody really knew what the energy mix was, and hence the sort of carbon intensity of the system. They assume that's just going to be fixed forever, and Bitcoin miners are never going to move to more renewable sources. So this study, you don't even need me to really debunk it for you. Just go look at the 3 academic responses which have been written to the study. Look at the methodology for yourself. It relies on a completely implausible assumption of how Bitcoin actually works, and it derives this crazy figure of Bitcoin warming the Earth by 2 degrees. So the study basically presumes or posits a fictional version of Bitcoin and then uses that to create this incredibly scary headline, which is now being recycled in the mainstream press. So go to the source material, people. This is really not a credible study to be citing, and it basically completely undermines his argument.